I'm really excited to have Elizabeth Watson here today. She was supposed to give a talk a year ago, and unfortunately that didn't work out. And so we're really, really glad that she has decided to come back on Zoom. And hopefully in the near future, she'll actually come here in person and we'll go out and look at some of the Long Island wetlands. So Elizabeth is an associate.
Or just drink beer.
Or just drink beer, that's true. Elizabeth is an associate professor in the Department of Biodiversity, Earth and Environmental Sciences at Drexel University. She got her master's and PhD from UC Berkeley. And then she worked at a couple places, including the Department of Land, Air and Water Resources at UC Davis, and as a research scientist for the EPA in Rhode Island. And since 2014, she's a professor at Drexel. Her work, as you can see from this beautiful picture already, focuses on coastal wetlands. She's worked, for example, in the tidal marshes in South San Francisco Bay. She investigates these ecosystems from different perspectives, including looking at paleoecological aspects, biogeochemical aspects that I'm very interested in. Importantly, her work focuses also on management and restoration of coastal wetlands, and more recently, she is focused on better understanding the impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise on tidal wetlands. She has a beautiful webpage. The Coastal Change Lab is her lab at Drexel. So if you want to learn more about her work, I encourage you to visit her webpage. She'll present some of the work related to climate change today in her talk, which the final title is Threats of Accelerated Sea Level Rise to Coastal Wetlands and Strategies to Build Climate Change Resilience. And I'm really, really happy that she's here. I think this topic is very relevant to many people at SoMAS, and I can already see that many people have decided to join us today. So Elizabeth, I'm really happy that you came, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Laura, for inviting me. And I guess I'm sorry that we're not in person, but it's also exciting to be able to connect with more people on Zoom. I invited some of my students. I think only one of them came, but you said it's on YouTube, so I can send them the link. So I'd like to start off by telling you why wetlands are valuable in the context of climate change. And so worldwide, coastal wetlands are really recognized as a transition zone that is really critical for buffering the coast from some of the effects of climate change. But at the same time, they're also one of the habitats that's most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and particularly accelerated sea level rise. So recent studies have shown that coastal wetlands in the northeastern part of the United States are disappearing, and they're disappearing not due to coastal development, but they're disappearing due to fragmentation and drowning, just like the wetlands in the Mississippi Delta. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is discuss some of the processes and rates of coastal marsh drowning, and review evidence that accelerated sea level rise is largely to blame, and describe the paradigm that's emerging in coastal wetland conservation in response to sea level rise. So I'm going to focus on a couple of adaptation techniques at the end that can be used to make coastal wetlands more resilient to sea level rise. And this image here shows some images of some of the wetlands that I've worked at around the Northeast. Shelter Island, which is an island off of Long Island, perhaps some of you have visited. You can see fragmentation and ponds forming on the marsh. In the Hudson River, this is just south of the Tappan Zee Bridge, and this is Piermont Marsh. Again, places where ponds are forming and expanding. And then Winnapaug Pond in Rhode Island, one of my favorite coastal ponds. And there you can see that the wetlands are ponding. I think this is an image from high tide, so it's maybe a little bit exaggerated, but you have what we call these waffle marshes, where you have just a little ring of wetlands left and the water and or syrup in the middle of the waffle shape. So in the context of sea level rise, coastal wetlands are really important in that they protect coastal areas from flooding, I think the general rule of thumb is that for every kilometer of coastal wetlands you have, intact coastal wetlands, that reduces storm surge height by about 6 centimeters. And this happens through various mechanisms. The coastal wetlands have like very dense stems, and because storm surges are shallow water waves, those stems, interact and create friction and help reduce the height of that storm surge. The porous soils also store flood water. And having wetlands on your shore edge can help reduce erosion because they're much more cohesive than, sand or sand beaches, because of that kind of interlocking root system of your healthy marsh plants. I'm going to turn my volume up. You can hear me maybe a little bit better. Okay, so another reason that we care about wetlands in the context of climate change is it can actually contribute to improving water quality. And this is important because as the main effect of climate change that we're experiencing is, the human built environment in the Northeast is actually flooding, increased frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events. And so this means that, you often end up with very poor quality water in coastal areas, water that has a lot of sediment in it from these storms, as well as nutrients. Where I live, we have a lot of CSOs. These heavy storms cause CSO discharge and bring water, nutrients, untreated sewage to coastal areas. And so, the wetlands can kind of help protect against that. And they do it from a number of different mechanisms. So the wetlands trap sediment. As the tide goes up, sediment settles out of suspension, it's trapped by the plants, and the tide goes down, there's less sediment in it. Wetlands also assimilate nutrients. So the plants are the soils are mostly anoxic, and the plants assimilate nutrients as they grow. And some of those nutrients are sequestered relatively permanently, at least on shorter term timescales. And then wetlands also perform denitrification functions, which is something that we use in advanced wastewater treatment like shown here, but wetlands do it naturally. And this is because wetlands provide that labile carbon source as well as anoxic conditions that leads to the reduction of nitrate to N2 gas. So it's taking that bioavailable nitrate out of circulation. Coastal wetlands also sequester carbon on an acre by acre basis. Coastal wetlands sequester more carbon than forests or tropical rainforests, even some of the more productive and larger forests throughout the world. And they do it not through above ground sequestration of carbon in their biomass, but actually the sequestration of carbon in soils. So coastal wetlands tend to have relatively carbon dense soils, and the soils are anoxic. Again, that doesn't decompose on relatively short timescales. So you have this, sequestration of carbon, which, can help mitigate climate change. And actually some projects or sources of funding, carbon mitigation funding, cap and trade funding, carbon credits, have actually gone into restoration projects that restore forests or restore wetlands as a way to help mitigate climate change, help mitigate and assimilate some of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. Inland wetlands also sequester plenty of carbon as well, but they tend to emit large volumes of methane. And so because methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, then that doesn't necessarily have that kind of climate change mitigation function. Whereas in more saline conditions, the presence of sulfate, because it tends to inhibit methanogenesis, because it's the reduction of sulfate to sulfides is a more sort of energetically favorable biogeochemical reaction than methanogenesis. And so you tend to have, those anoxic conditions, the sequestration of carbon, but not necessarily a lot of methane production. So those are some of the reasons why you should care about coastal wetlands in the context of climate change. They contribute to improving water quality, reducing flood damages, and sequestering greenhouse gases. So as I'm sure you're all aware, sea level rise has been accelerating over the past 50 to 150 years. This is a figure that reproduces global sea levels using a number of different data sources. This is a paper produced by a colleague of mine, Kopp at Rutgers. So what you see is that over the last 2,000 years or so, you see that globally sea level increased a little bit during this time period about 1,000 years ago, often associated with the medieval warm period. Sea levels decreased during this period over here between about 1600, 1800, often associated with the little ice age. So during that time, conditions were colder, the marine waters were colder, and there was more, continental ice storage. So sea levels were actually falling. And then sea level has increased over the last 100 to 150 years associated with, fossil fuel combustion, warmer temperatures, and higher sea levels. So how is sea level rise affecting coastal wetlands? So marsh drowning was first noticed in Long Island in the early 2000s in terms of, the northeastern United States. And my understanding of what happened is the Department of Environmental Conservation for New York, they were really interested in finding out whether their tidal wetlands program had been successful over the previous 30 years in protecting tidal wetlands from development. So they're interested in going out and, quantifying the area of tidal wetlands, comparing it to that in the 70s and figuring out, where wetlands were disappearing due to fill and build type of development. And what they found instead was pretty widespread evidence that while their program had been successful at protecting wetlands, the wetlands were nonetheless disappearing. And this is an image here from Jamaica Bay. This is in New York City, just south of the Kennedy Airport between Brooklyn and Queens. And what you see is that this area had been just kind of a broad, expansive grass, in the 1980s. And by the early mid to 2000s, you can see that you just have these kind of scattered clumps of green. You see a lot of mud. You see a lot of open water. So really, the wetlands were found to be fragmenting and drowning. And this was first described by Ellen Hardig, who now works for New York City Parks, in a paper in Wetlands in 2002. But it was, and so that study just focused on Jamaica Bay, but it has been found to be pretty much universally true for all of the wetlands across Long Island. So Jamaica Bay is kind of an extreme example, but the wetlands across Long Island are coming to look like this. There was another study that came out about the same time in EOS, and this was led by Mike Carney at University of Maryland. And he used a spectral unmixing method in concert with Landsat imagery to look at changes in wetlands, coastal wetlands in Delaware and Chesapeake Bay. And so they found that the percentage of wetlands that were in deteriorated condition, and by that I mean like a lot of mud, a lot of open water, it increased 25% between the 1980s and the 1990s. And so this images here show kind of what that looks like, right? So you have less plants, more open water, and more mud. So back in, I guess around 2011, when I first started, sorry, one more thing. I'm going to briefly talk about some work I've been doing in California. And so I wanted to highlight that wetlands in the Northeast, wetlands in the Mississippi Delta are not the only coastal wetlands that are disappearing. In general, we don't tend to see much coastal wetland loss in California for a number of different reasons. But one of the places I've been working for the last 15, almost 20 years is this area in central Monterey Bay. And there they have seen really dramatic wetland loss. So this is a picture on the left from the 1980s, but you can see the wetland vegetation in kind of darker colors and the bare mud areas reflecting this lighter color. And then 20 years later, you can see there's very little vegetation left, just these kind of higher elevation spots along the tidal channels. And this is a place where what happened was there was the dredging of a deep water port, and that led to kind of a rapid increase in the amount of flooding that these wetlands experienced over a really short time scale. So there's kind of a lot of other things going on in this place as well. But I think that is the simplest explanation for why the wetlands are disappearing in this spot. So back in around 2011, I was working for the EPA in Narragansett, Rhode Island. And I wanted to understand better what the pattern and rates of marsh loss were that we were seeing. And I focused on wetlands in Rhode Island and Massachusetts because, you know, there were folks working on wetlands on Long Island that were quantifying that. There was a study published focusing on Cape Cod in 2009. There was folks in the Fish and Wildlife Service looking at wetlands in Connecticut, but no one was really looking at change in kind of Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts to the west of Cape Cod. And so I decided to look at these wetlands and figure out if they were disappearing and how quickly. And I compared, I digitized wetlands from 1972 and 2011. And because the 72 imagery is a coarser resolution and is also panchromatic, I adjusted the 2011 imagery to more closely match the 70s imagery. So I did a hue saturation intensity conversion, which converted the color image to, or 4-band imagery to panchromatic. And I also resampled it so that the resolution was the same. So if you compare kind of higher and lower resolution imagery, you can it suggests that there's kind of, you know, more channels and more area of, you know, open water, just because you're able to see things that are, you know, are smaller in size. And so I wanted to make sure I was really comparing apples to apples. And so what I found was that there was about a 17% vegetation loss, or loss of about 17% of the vegetation from coastal wetlands in the Rhode Island and Massachusetts area that I looked at between the 70s and 2000. And of those areas that I looked at, I saw marsh loss in 35 of 36 of the units. So there was only one unit that hadn't had experienced any loss. And the rates ranged from, you know, actually, you know, negative or a slight gain, all the way up to a loss of 40% of the vegetation. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what that looks like. This is some images from the 1970s and 2011. And what you see here is you see that the vegetation loss is really concentrated in this figure on where the different tidal channels come together, these kind of bifurcation nodes. And that's one place where you see loss happening. So my explanation for that would be, you know, the tidal prism has increased, the tides have increased. So, you know, the amount of water coming in and out of these back barrier marshes has increased, which has led to some adjustments in the tidal channels. They've tended to enlarge and erode headwards. This is another example of that. This is looking at an older image from the 1930s versus the 2000s. And this is a place that's extensively ditched. So you have these nice linear grid ditches that were put in, you know, for to drain the marsh and help control mosquitoes, mostly back in the WPA era, but I think there was actually a lot of ditching that went on before that. So here you can see again that these tidal channels have widened and, you know, eroded headwards as well. This is an image here from Massachusetts. It shows tidal channel widening. It also shows some straightening and recession of the shore edge, the marsh edge here. Channel widening, but then also the formation of this large interior pond on the marsh platform. So that kind of summarizes some of the types of changes that we're seeing. So, you know, that work by, you know, Ellen Hardig and Mike Carney and, you know, Steve Smith works for the National Park Service on Cape Cod. I think they pretty clearly established that we saw these rates of marsh loss. But they weren't really able to tie that to sea level rise. And so what I did was I used this conceptual model. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to understand how plants were responding to sea level rise. And how you can kind of think about this is that you have vegetation that grows at a range of elevations. So there's a lower elevation limit below which the plant is flooded, the soil is flooded too much, the plant's not able to oxygenate its root zone and survive. And they have an upper elevation limit. And that might be set by, you know, competition with upland plants. I think, you know, these wetland plants tend to grow pretty much okay in fresher conditions, but you know, you have this range of elevations that you find these wetlands plants, and then somewhere in that range you're going to see a growth optimum where the plants are growing the best. And so according to Jim Morris, you know, one of my collaborators and the person who developed this kind of thought, this conceptual model, was that if your marshes were sitting at an elevation that was above that growth optimum, what would happen is that if sea level rise occurred, that would actually increase biomass growth, and it would kind of bring the marshes up above the, the water level elevation. And so you'd kind of have this feedbacks that would stable the marsh elevation in this kind of stable region of this conceptual model. And on the other hand, if you were in the unstable region, it would mean your marsh platform was below that growth optimum. So if the marsh platform was below that growth optimum, the plants would grow worse with increased flooding and would not be stable with sea level rise. And so the reason why the biomass is so important is because that these wetlands in southern New England, there's just not much of a sediment supply. I was a very peripheral part of a monitoring program where we were going out and collecting water and looking at suspended sediment. And it was like, 0.2 milligrams per liter or something like that. Like there's just not a lot of sediment in this water. What's really helping the marsh grow upwards is much more the root network that you can see here. And so what I did was we grew these marsh plants at different elevations in the structure that you call a marsh organ. And then in concert with that, we measured water level elevations at 5 different wetlands around Narragansett Bay and did a whole bunch of elevation measures. So together, my intention was that these different measures would allow us to determine where the growth optimum was, and then whether our marshes were sitting above or below that growth optimum. So one of the interesting things that we found at the outset was that at the 5 marshes where I put in these water level loggers, I found that the amount of marsh vegetation loss that we saw between the 1970s and mid 2000s were a pretty direct correlation of the elevation. So to back up a little bit here, I want to say that most of these wetlands are back barrier marshes. And so it's really necessary to put out your own water level loggers in order to calculate tidal datums, just because the data product that exists doesn't do a good job. And then at that time, there wasn't really a data product available. And so we found that the wetland that was, sitting above the level of the high tide had lost basically no vegetation, and the wetland that was sitting very far below the elevation of the high tide lost the most vegetation. So to me, this suggests that inundation is really a very key part in understanding, how wetlands are responding to sea level rise, or how well the plants are able to grow. We also saw that there was higher below ground biomass at higher elevations. So we didn't see that kind of parabolic relationship where there was a particular growth optimum. Instead, we just saw that we saw the best growth at the highest elevations. And I also was able to CT scan some of these cores, some of our organ cores, to look at the below ground biomass. So these are just some examples of what CT scanning your marsh cores might look like. On the left-hand side, you can see a marsh core where you have like some pretty robust marsh roots and rhizomes. And on the right-hand side, you can see roots and rhizomes that are finer and more intricately connected. So these are just some examples of, what these CT cores look like. So what I found when I analyzed the CT scans was that you were able to see that the pots that were growing at the highest elevation had more robust development of roots and rhizomes at lower depths in the soil column. And so this makes sense to me. It seems like the plants that were growing at the lowest elevations, they had kind of anoxic conditions, or mostly anoxic conditions below about 15 centimeters. So they just weren't able to grow as far deep into the soil column, and so they produced less below ground biomass. Okay, so kind of putting this all together, what we found is that we saw the highest growth at the highest elevations. So that was about 90 centimeters above NAVP 88, which is pretty much equivalent to sea level. So about a meter above sea level, we saw the best growth. And then thinking about, the elevation surveys, those that I did on the ground in Rhode Island versus those that I looked at from Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, and southern Massachusetts, where the tidal ranges were similar. You know, I didn't want to get up into like the Gulf of Maine or something like that, where the tidal ranges were really different from the places I was working in Rhode Island. But we found that, you know, the vast majority, over 90% of the wetlands were sitting below that growth optimum. So coming back to that conceptual model, that suggests that, you know, our wetlands are in this unstable region. We saw this growth optimum at above a meter, about a meter above sea level, and we see that most of our wetlands are sitting far below that. Okay, so so I was further able to, so that's just kind of one study that I did, a field study. I was further able to validate this using a number of different plants. I grew plants in the greenhouse. I grew plants in the field. I grew Spartina alterniflora, Spartina patens, Juncus gerardi, Deciduous baccata, kind of the northeastern marsh ecosystem dominance. I worked with a number of different students, one of whom actually went to grad school to study marshes, which was a first for me. And we, you know, basically found, you know, the same pattern over and over again, where the plants grew best at the highest elevation, and that, you know, kind of comparing that to the conditions that you see in the field suggests that the plants are pretty currently stressed. Okay, so that's a little bit of a depressing story. So I want to turn really quickly to explaining what we can do about it. So some of the ways that we can help coastal areas be more resilient to sea level rise, or at least our coastal wetlands, is by using techniques or restoration techniques, intervention techniques that are a little bit more explicitly focused on thinking about climate change and how to make our wetlands more resilient. So one of those methods has included adding sediment to wetlands. So a lot of our wetlands in places are near places where there's dredging for navigation. And so, you know, you can pile up sediment on wetlands, and if the plants recolonize relatively quickly, then, you know, that can buy the wetlands, you know, a few more decades or some time. Another method of trying to make sure that wetlands survive in the future is focusing on managing wetlands at the marsh upland border. And so this could involve things like removing barriers, or you know, making sure that there's open space in places where you have a very gentle slope and it's conducive to migration. So I know, for example, there are programs in New York where you know, some of the nonprofits in the state, like the Nature Conservancy, they're interested in acquiring parcels in places where, you know, wetland migration is expected to occur. Different living shoreline approaches have been used to try to slow the erosion along marsh edges. And so this can include the installation of these biomaterials like these core logs, and building kind of artificial oyster reefs with oyster shells, with the idea that, you know, plants can recolonize. You know, you have mussels can colonize in these areas. You can build some kind of like breakwaters out of oyster shell, which will encourage oysters to grow on these shells. So just the idea of, you know, using kind of natural materials to try to make your edges erode less quickly. And then the last thing shown on this image is actually installing shallow drainage areas in places where the wetlands are drowning to try to re-encourage vegetation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So the project that I was involved with is at the Narrow River Estuary, which is in Rhode Island. It's Fish and Wildlife Service owned land. And you can see in the Narrow River Estuary, you have this pattern of ponds kind of replacing the marsh vegetation on the marsh platform. And I'm going to show you just a quick time series of, you know, what this looks like, and kind of a worse place and a better place. So this is Shelter Island, again, that island off of Long Island. And this is an image from the 90s. So you can see some kind of like ponded areas or places maybe not doing so great on this image. And then moving forward to 2015, you can see that the areas with the ponding are expanded over that time period. So that's kind of a less impacted site. A site that's kind of at the end of its life is in Connecticut, kind of a little bit south of Lyme, Connecticut. And so this is a picture from the 90s. And here you can see this wetland vegetation where the ponds already were kind of coalescing at that period. And there's some fringes of vegetation along the channel edges and the marsh upland border. And then showing images from 2015, you can see that there's just not very much vegetation left. You just have that vegetation left along the channels. And even all of this area vegetation has died, and maybe a little bit along the marsh upland border, but it's basically completely converted to open water. So the way that people think about marsh loss, the way that it's modeled in sea level rise models is kind of like, this idea that you have marsh vegetation growing at different elevations, and you would expect with sea level rise that the plants that are growing kind of at the lower elevation are going to die off, and the plants at the upper elevations are going to be able to survive. But that's not really what we're seeing when we look at the the formation and expansion of these ponds. These formation and expansion of these ponds is actually happening at relatively high elevations, and so it's completely not captured by any kind of modeling method like SLAM or the Marsh equilibrium model that seeks to try to predict what's happening with sea level rise in the future. And so my explanation for this actually has to do with the groundwater table. So in general, what we find is that the water table is pretty close to the surface in the marsh interior at the highest elevations in the marsh. And the water table, at least at low tide, drains pretty far below the soil surface. So this is an image of the tides taken from a couple of landscape positions in a wetland in Rhode Island. And so you can see that at least during the spring tides in the upper landscape position, the water table is pretty close to the surface. It does drain down a bit during neap tides. But when you look at the channel edges, so the marsh elevations are shown here in green. But when you look at the channel edges, you can see that the water table elevation is really far below the soil surface. It's actually, over 20 centimeters below the soil surface. Whereas in the interior, it's just kind of right at the surface. And so this is a function of, just Darcy's law. So your hydraulic, so the discharge is a function of the product of the hydraulic gradient and the soil conductivity. And so when you were close to the edge of the tidal channel, that water table in the marsh might be up here at the marsh surface, and the water level in the channel is really far below that. It might be a meter below that. And so that hydraulic gradient is much more steeper, and so those areas are better drained. On the other hand, when you're in the marsh interior, that difference in hydraulic head might be the same, but the spatial, the length between those two spots is much broader. And so there's just not as much of a hydraulic gradient. And so the discharge rates of water from the marsh platform are really slow. And so you just have those water tables that sit there. And so my interpretation or my hypothesis, or the way that I kind of look at things, is that it's actually, high marsh elevations that are more vulnerable to sea level rise, because the water table is sitting right at the surface and really affecting the plant's ability to grow and oxygenate the root zone. This is why you have short vegetation on the tidal marsh and then really tall vegetation on the channel edges as well. So the project that we looked at installed these kind of shallow drainage areas in these that drain these kind of ponded spots to see if we could encourage revegetation. And so we're trying to mimic kind of a natural process. So over here, you see a pond in the same area, the Narrow River. And what happened is that channel incision basically drained this pond in the 1970s. And, the plants were able to recolonize. So we're trying to kind of mimic this natural process of pond capture that happens in wetlands, but can be really very, very slow in places that don't have much of a tidal range, just because there's not much there's not much dynamics in those tidal channels. And so the sites that we looked at are 2 areas in the Narrow River Estuary, a more southerly site called Connecticut and a more northerly site called Middlebridge. And we compared vegetation and water levels, as well as some other things, in a control area that was not runneled or drained, and an impact area that was runneled or drained in these 2 sites, in Connecticut and in Middlebridge. And we did we used a before after control impact monitoring design, where we monitored stuff for 1 year before the construction, as well as for several years after the construction. So I have a little bit of a timeline here. So we monitored in 2014, and these runnels were dug in 2015 and 2016. In retrospect, I think it would have been much better to monitor for several years before construction, but I don't know how many times you're able to have that kind of opportunity to know that, a restoration project is going to happen in 3 years. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but and so what we did was we looked at vegetation, we looked at groundwater levels. So I instrumented some of the groundwater wells that our nonprofit partner put in the fall of every year. And yeah, so that's kind of our data sources. So when we look at the percentage of the vegetation transects that we monitored where there was bare ground, we found that in the places that were runneled, we saw declines in the bare ground along the transects. So for Middlebridge, it declined from about 15% to about 2%. And in Connecticut, it declined from about 7% to basically nothing. In contrast, the places that weren't runneled, the control areas, the areas of bare ground across the transect stayed pretty static. We also looked at satellite imagery, which basically showed the same thing, although we did have imagery from different times of the year. And so it was actually, even though it was much more of a landscape scale type of analysis, it was also a little bit less consistent just because the plants do die back a bit. And so we had some spring imagery, which turned out to not be probably the best choice. But we saw that in Connecticut, in the place that was runneled, the percentage of patchy marsh and open water, like basically almost disappeared. And then in the Middlebridge impact site, we saw a pretty similar thing, although the reference sites also appeared to have, at least at Middlebridge, they also had declines in open water and patchy vegetation. So this is an image of what this looks like on the ground. So this is from Connecticut, looking down the transect towards the other side of the estuary. And so what you can see is this area that had been ponded in 2014. By 2016, after a relatively minor and relatively cheap intervention, the marsh was able to revegetate. So looking at the water levels from one site during 1 year, there's really a ridiculous amount of data here. What you see is that in the control areas, that low tide water level is much higher than it is in the runneled areas. So we have in red and brown, the 2 sites that I instrumented in, this is in Middlebridge, that were runneled. You can see that the low tide water levels are really quite far below the marsh surface. And those control areas, or those areas that weren't runneled, the water table was pretty much right at the marsh surface during low tide. The tide levels at high tides were identical in the runnel areas and control areas, but you can see a difference in the low tide groundwater levels between the runnel and control areas. And this does look different in 2014. So the pre-construction data, you see that the groundwater levels at low tide, they're kind of different, not necessarily exactly the same between all the sites, but you don't see any systematic difference between the area that was runneled and the control area, suggesting that there was a change associated with the installation of these runnels. And so my explanation for what's going on here is that by installing these tidal channels in the marsh, you're basically encouraging more of the marsh interior to function a little bit more like these channel edges, where the groundwater level drops down to very low elevations below the marsh surface. And I think that this can be something that's really quite beneficial in terms of making coastal wetlands more resilient to sea level rise. But it also is something that has to be thought about and managed very carefully. You know, we have this whole history in the Northeast of installing these mosquito ditches, which led to subsidence and, you know, co-opting of the tidal channel network and drainage and things like that, which, you know, at the end of the day, didn't necessarily turn out to be very beneficial for the maintenance of marshes over time. So really, I think it's necessary to think very critically about, you know, are ponds expanding, how those ponds function in the landscape, whether they're a symptom of sea level rise, whether they seem to have been there for a long time, whether they're stable, and all that kind of stuff. So it's not like we need to go out and dig a bunch of ditches and drain all these ponds, but this can be a way to encourage revegetation in places where ponding appears to be expanding as a symptom of sea level rise. So it looks like I've been talking for almost 45 minutes, and I have like a whole bunch more slides prepared on sediment additions, but I think I know we're all zoomed out, and I think I'm just going to skip those. So, so in summary, across the northeastern United States, coastal wetlands are disappearing. And the rates and patterns of drowning that I saw were about 17% in Rhode Island and parts of Massachusetts between the 70s and mid 2000s. And there was a study that came out by different agencies. It was a contractor, but different agencies in New York, and they found a really identical rate of loss for the wetlands on Long Island. It was about 0.4% per year. And it was, you know, if you annualize it, it's completely identical to what I found. So it seems like, you know, kind of averaging over these broader scales, the wetlands in southern New England, the wetlands in Rhode Island, the wetlands in probably Connecticut and Long Island are all disappearing at about the same rate. And it's, you know, something like 5% per decade. I found that the marsh elevations were basically all below the growth optimum, which suggests that they're not going to be stable against future sea level rise. Secondly, I found a pretty strong correlation between the elevation of the marsh platform and how fast the plants were disappearing, suggesting that inundation patterns are contributing to loss. I mean, correlation is not causation, but to me, it suggests that, you know, these things are related. One promising technique for lengthening the lifespan of drowning wetlands, particularly in places where you're getting the formation and expansion of these interior ponds, is through the installation of runnels. The thing that I was going to talk about, but I'm not, was about sediment placement, but that's like a whole different world, and you can ask me about that after the end of the talk if you want to. So I would like to acknowledge some of the folks that I worked with on these projects. The person who was really championing digging the runnels and doing all the monitoring was Wenley Ferguson, who works for a nonprofit called Save the Bay, Save Narragansett Bay. And I, you know, also work with folks on that project with the Fish and Wildlife Service, with the National Estuary and Research Reserve, and with the EPA. So I think I'm just going to end there, and I guess see if we have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for this really, really interesting talk. People are clapping. You can't see it or hear it. But are there any questions? Somebody raised their hand. Well,
that would be me, yes. I guess I'll turn on my video for an actual question. Yes, that's really intriguing. The role of drainage in these systems, and I have done a lot of work in French Guiana and the intertidal regions. And one of the things that characterizes those systems is very intricate and complex burrowing by crustaceans of the sediment associated with the mangroves and the mangrove fringe and the flats. And these burrow systems actually connect to the channels, and they can drain and interact over tens of meters away from the channels within a single tidal cycle. And so my question really is, in your systems, what are the roles of, beyond the plants and the mud and the root systems and the channels themselves, what role do other benthic organisms like crustaceans play in dictating the hydrology of the marsh systems?
Wow, that's a really fascinating question. I know that, so some of the wetlands I worked in California, they actually had subterranean tidal channels. There were like tidal channels that had existed, and then the plants kind of fell over into them, and then sediment built on top of them, but they were functioning as like these underground channels. So I know that the hydrology can actually be a lot more complex than it looks like on the surface. And thinking about like all the armies of, you know, fiddler crabs and things like that that you see in these wetlands, it seems really unlikely that they don't play a role. I haven't really, I would say I haven't really studied this too much. I did at one point develop like a spatial model of crab burrow distribution, because I wanted to understand where the crabs were living and how that could affect, you know, wetlands. And what we actually found was that the crabs would burrow in only like a very specific type of sediment, or the burrows only were maintained in very specific types of sediment. So they didn't tend to burrow in places that were too soft or too hard. And so the burrows were actually limited to certain positions in the landscape. And if there were burrows in those other areas, they just were not that prevalent, or they didn't, in the case of them being too soft, they just didn't maintain themselves over time. I have no idea how to study this, though. Did you, how would you, you know, do you have any recommendations on how you can like image them? I think some people have put like plaster casts and things like that in burrows to try to figure out their shape and how deep there are and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's certainly one approach. One of my colleagues, Emily Michaud from Brest University in France, what she's done is it coupled the casting of subterranean burrow systems with drone surveys of the kinds of the expressions of the burrows at the surface, which allows you to then extrapolate what the subterranean distribution of these over larger areas of the biogenic galleries and tunnels are. Otherwise, you're pretty much stuck with just very localized observations, you know, around a particular channel or something. But to extrapolate it up to a whole marsh, or in this case, mangrove systems, you need to have some aerial coverage. So anyway, I'm just saying that maybe you can use drone surveys to extend local measurements to a larger scale estimation of what's going on. So other than that, I don't have any real recommendations.
Yeah, I know that I mean, I've visited some wetlands in Argentina, and it does seem like the crabs play a really important ecosystem role there. You know, they're sort of like the I don't know if like the keystone organism is the right word, but they seem like they control a lot of different things about the habitat and the ecosystem. So yeah, I wouldn't doubt that it was you know, they play an important role in the Northeast as well.
Well, thank you. And I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question.
Other questions, maybe from the students? Oh yeah, there's another question.
I really enjoyed your talk. I did some similar wetland work down in the Chesapeake Bay, so it was really interesting to see what you guys are doing up here in this region. I guess I was just wondering, when you're looking at, have you looked at different, like how have been the different species responses? Like I'm wondering if you've seen any sort of species turnover in these areas, like from, you know, more flooding intolerant high marsh species to more flood tolerant species. Like we saw some of that with like juncus coming in where there had been patents, and I'm just wondering if you saw similar trends to that.
Sorry, I think my battery is getting a little bit low. I have to like make a little run for my charger. So I know that there is data from Cape Cod, where they found that Spartina patens is converted to Spartina alterniflora like very pervasively over the last decades. From my perspective, I think it can be a little bit tricky to pick out the two plants from, you know, air photos or satellite imagery, but for people that are a little more confident about that, that's something that they've definitely reported. In Narragansett Bay, the National Estuarine Research Reserve has done vegetation resurveys, and so they found that that has occurred as well. So that transition from Spartina patens to Spartina alterniflora. From my work on the ground, I actually like that place that I showed you in Bristol, Rhode Island, where I actually measure the groundwater levels. It's actually pretty interesting because that is a place where the transition is happening today. And it's almost like all the patents just died off, and it just created these huge like bare areas. And so it seems like it can actually even take a while for the alterniflora to catch up. It's not so much like a competition thing. It was like the patents just all disappears, and then it's bare for a couple of years, and then the alterniflora moves in. And then the last thing I was going to say is that this is just like a complete observation. It's not like a study or anything like that, but there definitely are some places where we see patens be the plant that's more common along the channel edges because it's kind of better drain conditions, and then alterniflora being on the marsh platform. So it's almost like a switch in like which is like how you kind of conceive of wetland plant distributions. It's just like turned over, you know, it's just like completely opposite what you'd expect. So in that study in the Narrow River, they also did like a sediment addition in a different part of the estuary than where I was working. And they asked me originally, they said, so like what should be the biological benchmark for patens? Like how much sediment do we want to put? Like what elevation do we want it to be? And you know, because I had done a bunch of elevation surveys, and I said, like, I looked at the data, and the patens and the alterniflora are growing at the same elevations, you know, so it wasn't really an elevation difference. It was just like how stressed the plants were from flooding. So, and maybe like too much information, but
no,
thanks
that's
for the
super
question.
interesting. Thank you so much.
Do we have more questions?
Actually, I was just going to say something. This is Josie, about the system that Bob was talking about. Those were largely mangrove environments. And so you have the mangroves and the roots of the mangroves, but you don't have the grasses like, you know, in the temperate wetland marshes. So maybe that's one difference.
Yeah, I could imagine that mangrove environments might have a little bit more structure for longer term maintenance of crab burrows than more like those annual grasses, you know, where you kind of have some turnover every year and things like that.
Yeah. Interesting. Very nice talk.
Are those wetlands in Guyana, are they a fun place to work, or is it kind of like mosquito bug?
Well, it depends on your definition of fun. If you like being buried, you know, being up to your neck in mud, and the rest of whatever is exposed is being eaten alive by insects. Yep, it's a lot of fun. No, it's great. It's like field work, I'm sure, in many places. It's you have to enjoy getting a bit down and dirty, I guess. So.
Students, questions? Anybody? All right.
If there are no other questions, can I ask a technical question where you did the CT scanning that you showed?
So when I was in Rhode Island, we were doing CT scanning at just like a small little radiology kind of outpatient clinic. I have in the past done CT scanning when I was at Davis, we used the veterinary school. My postdoc advisor his wife was faculty at the vet school, so it was like a pretty nice connection. But it's a very interesting question because I don't have a connection where I am now, and I'm actually looking for one. So we have a medical school, so I think it's possible to do it kind of within my university system. But
yeah. Sometimes you can get in at nighttime in a medical facility if they have some downtime. Although, you know, if they have a lot of emergency use, they can go through the night. But there are more and more facilities around the country and also in Canada that are dedicated explicitly to environmental CT scanning, and so I can at least tell you contacts in Canada. I'm sure they'd be really interested in collaborating, but of course now the border is kind of blocked. But
yeah, I think most of the we have a research CT on our campus, but it's a micro CT. So,
okay.
You know, you can only put like a little plug of sediment in it. So it's not quite the right settings. Apparently like the CTs for people and like horses are a pretty good fit for scanning cores.
You have to go talk to the UPenn people, the vet school there.
Yeah, I have this worry that anything associated with Penn is going to be really expensive, but I might try to use some connection.
We have a connection. We'll tell our son, but
yeah, my daughter actually works in the Temple Hospital, and I was like, and she works at night, and I was like, so can I? Could you go make friends for the radiology department for me, please? So I'm not optimistic, but we'll see.
all right. Anyone else? Laura? Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, I think
Laura,
maybe the last question should be like, what's your outlook for, you know, the marshes around Long Island? Like,
oh. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that I do think that they're not just like, they can't be ignored, you know, if we want those wetland habitats to continue in the future. I think we have to be proactive for planning, you know, and it's definitely a kind of an unfortunate planning horizon. You know, it's not like really the next 10 years, it's like trying to think about the next 50 years. And so it's something that's just not maybe, you know, and maybe, you know, conservation planning is kind of thinking about that horizon with sea level rise. But it also seems like with sea level rise, maybe Long Island has other things to think about besides just its wetlands. You know, you have like issues with water, like water, is there enough water, the salinity of water, the nutrient pollution of the water, you know, storms and things like that. So hopefully they won't be ignored, but there's definitely a lot of broader issues as well. Thanks for having me, Laura.
thanks for coming.